Tilika, Samantha Tilika. I may know a Samantha Tilika. Anyway, so thank you all for joining us. And what I thought I might talk about briefly today is just some ideas I have on meditation. And my understanding is when I first came to Sri Lanka in 1976, I got the impression that meditation was not a common practice amongst the average Buddhist. In fact, I got the impression that meditation wasn't a very common practice even within the Sangha. Now, by that, I don't mean nobody meditated. I saw people on Poya days perhaps spending 5 or 10 minutes doing some meditation. And in some of the viharas I stayed in, sometimes in the evening, Hamdarus would do a puja, and once again they do 5 or 10 minutes meditation. But as for taking meditation seriously and having it an integral part of one's spiritual practice, I can't say that I found that to be very common. And my understanding is that even in the 20 years that I was in Sri Lanka, I got the impression that there was something of a revival of interest in meditation. And you had the beginning of meditation courses, 5-day or 10-day meditations. And then somewhat later, you had people like Venerable Dhammajiva from Mitrigala giving meditation courses. And then you had the well-known and respected meditation teacher, Sri Goenka, actually established a meditation center out of Kandy in Gampala, the road to Gampala. And so that there has been something of a revival of interest in meditation. And when we look at the West nowadays, one aspect of the Buddhist meditation that the Buddha taught, mindfulness, has become very, very popular. Psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors who are dealing with pain management, and quite a lot of other things have discovered that sati or samma sati, taught by the Buddha, a unique teaching of the Buddha, has got many practical applications. So just earlier today, in preparation for this talk, I went to Amazon Books and put in mindfulness to see how many books had mindfulness in their title. And I found, just very briefly going through, actually 81 different books dealing with mindfulness and relationships, mindfulness and pain management, mindfulness and relaxation. There were a lot of them. Some people think that this is a very encouraging trend, and I would agree with them. And other people think that it's encouraging, but unfortunate that mindfulness has been taken out of the Dhamma. Because within Buddhism, at least, mindfulness is only one of the steps leading to spiritual growth and development. And some people argue that if it is taken out of the Buddha's ethical teachings and teachings of right speech and etc., that it is diminished to some degree. And I would agree with that too. But hopefully the interest in mindfulness will lead people to looking at other aspects of Buddhism, not just this one particular type. Now, I think that you can categorize the Buddhist teachings of meditation in relation to thoughts. So it seems to me that there are some meditations the Buddha taught which are about stopping thoughts or controlling thoughts. There are some meditations about observing thoughts, just standing back and with detached observation, just looking at your thoughts. And there are other meditations that the Buddha taught which are about arousing and utilizing thoughts. So if you take the first type, controlling thoughts, so some particular practices of mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati, would be an example of that. One way this meditation practice is taught is one tries to control and then silence, gradually silence or slow down the process of thinking. Yeah? And then in the case of the second type, observing or watching thoughts, well, that would be an example of mindfulness. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha talks about mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, etc. And one aspect of this is also not trying to stop your thoughts, but observing them, watching them, becoming aware of them, being familiar with them, and then eventually becoming detached from them, so that you are not sucked into and um, identifying with your thoughts. Something like what Manori talked about in the last talk that you had. And then the last type is arousing and utilizing your thoughts. And one example of that would be metta bhavana. And another example of that would be mindfulness of the body, one aspect of that. And another one would be those meditations which are sometimes called anusati, the anusatis. And it is this type of meditation that the Buddha taught, which I would like to share some ideas I have about this. Now, I know that it's quite common for people in Sri Lanka to do some of the anusatis. So I've noticed that many people, they will do Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, and Sanghanusati. Recollecting, calling to mind, or contemplating the virtues of the Buddha. Recollecting, calling to mind, or contemplating the aspects of the Dhamma, and meditating, contemplating, calling to mind the power and the influence and the value of the Sangha. And I've talked to people about this, and almost always they tell me that what they do is they recite Iti piso bhagava araham samma sambuddho or Swakato bhagavanta dhammo sanditthiko akaliko. As I understand it, what most people do is they think that Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, Sanghanusati is just mainly reciting or repeating in Pali goodness me, there's just been a huge explosion. Wow, I have no idea what that was, but it was a very, very big explosion. My house has been shaking. Anyway, we'll find out what that was tomorrow. But I would like to suggest that there are other ways that this meditation can be done. And the reason why the Buddha thought that it might be a good idea to arouse and then utilize your thoughts is because thoughts do have a particular power for good for positive ways and also for negative ways. When we have negative thoughts, of course, it can lead us, if we follow them, they can lead us into doing negative things. But it is also true the opposite. That is, that certain thoughts may very well encourage us to do positive things, or at least to contemplate positive states. And I think that this is certainly so in the case of the recollections of the Buddha. Now, quite a few years ago, one of the first books I ever wrote was this book here, Matra Cheta's Hymn to the Buddha. And this is an English rendering of a work that was written about 500 years after the Buddha in Sanskrit, and it's called the Satta Panchasataka, the Hymn to the Buddha in 150 verses, or 150 shlokas. And the whole purpose of this book is to commemorate and to celebrate the Buddha's various virtues. So, for example, it's in 12 chapters, and one of them concerns praising the Buddha's physical features, the gentle smile he had, the radiant complexion that he had, the beauty of how and the grace with which he walked and spoke. Another one is about his patience, having to put up with all sorts of problems and difficulties, not unsimilar to what ordinary people have to put up with, but how he dealt with those things with such detachment and patience. And it talks about other very positive aspects of the Buddha. And the reason that I did this book was because I was so impressed by how meaningful and how beautiful and how inspiring these verses are. And I often think that instead of just repeating in Pali various things about the Buddha's virtues, it might be a good idea to do it in a language that you can understand, which is broader and covers more territory than just the traditional verses. And I think that this can have a great power, because I think that the Buddha was as close as you would come to the perfect human being. Now, in the case of Christians, they look at, say, Jesus as being perfect. And in many ways, I think he was. But Jesus was God. So you'd you'd expect God to be perfect. But I'm not a God. None of us are. And so we could never be like Jesus. But the Buddha was human. He was, now, sometimes people get the feeling that he was almost a God, but he never made that claim himself. He was born an ordinary human being, and through his own efforts and insights, he developed himself into what you would have to call a complete human being, Samma Sambuddha, where every possible human potential was brought to completion. And I always think that, so keeping that in mind can be very uplifting and inspiring, in the sense that I'm not a perfect person, but I am a human being. So I have the potential to rise above my ordinary human state to become extraordinary, as the Buddha was. In other words, it's possible for me to become enlightened. Not easy, but possible. And therefore, keeping in mind, contemplating, thinking about the perfection of the Buddha and all of his wonderful qualities can, I think, be very inspiring for anybody who is taking the Dhamma seriously. Now, if we look at the recollections taught by the Buddha, there are actually several different lists. So Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, Sanghanusati, that's in all this. Then Silanusati, recollecting one's own virtues. And then there's Karganusati, or we might say Dhananusati, recollecting one's own generosity. Then there's something which I have never seen mentioned in any book, and I've read quite a lot of books about Buddhism, Kalyana Mittanusati. The Buddha talked about recollecting how wonderful it is to have good friends, particularly spiritual friends. In one list, he talks about Anapanasati. Well, most people know about that. And then Marananusati, recollecting on the fact that one day we won't be here, or at least we won't be here in this body, recollecting our own impermanence. That could be quite a powerful thing. Then there's the recollection on the body, Kayanusati. And then finally there's the recollection on peace, Upasammanusati. Now, and as I said, there are several others in some other lists, but these are the main ones. Now, this is very interesting. In the Anguttara Nikaya, there are several suttas, quite long suttas, where the Buddha talks about the value of doing these practices, practicing some or one or two of these recollections. And in one of these, he's giving a talk to Mahanama, who was a Sakyan, a member, I think he was a member of the Buddhist family. And he says this, and I'll read it from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. Mahanama, you should develop these recollections while walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. You should develop these while engaged in your work and while living at home in a house full of your children. Now, I've been reading the suttas for many, many years, actually over 45 years. And I think I know the suttas pretty well now. And I know that the Buddha frequently talked about different types of meditation. But in every case, it seems that he's addressing primarily members of the Sangha. He's not addressing lay people. That doesn't mean that lay people couldn't do those meditations, but there's only one place where the Buddha specifically mentions that lay people can, and in fact even should, do the anusatis. I'll just read it one more time. Mahanama, you should develop the recollections while walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. You should develop them while engaged in your work and while living at home with your house full of children. So this is obviously not addressed to specifically to the Sangha. It's talking about, well, Dharani and Jnanasiha and Siri and Kolita, ordinary people who have got jobs and who have got living in a house with members of their family. I think that's very important, and I know nowhere else where the Buddha specifically includes lay people in the practice of meditation. So I think this makes the recollections rather important. Anyway, let's have a look at them. I've talked about the Buddhanusati. I'll move on and have a look at Silanusati. What does this mean? Well, I think it might have two aspects. One is to sit quietly every now and then, maybe once an evening, you do a mal puja, or maybe during Poya Day, you go to the Pansala and you spend the day there, or perhaps part of the day. And at some time, you sit quietly and perhaps you recite the Iti Piso, and then you sit down and you think of what good have I done in the last week? to sit and think about your virtues. Now, of course, in order to think about your virtues, you must have some virtues. And I think it is often the case that sometimes we do quite good things, but we never think about them, and we don't think that they're so important. We'll just say, oh, it's just a minor thing. It might have been a minor thing. But what makes virtue is an accumulation of perhaps minor things. Letting somebody go first in the line, or just smiling at somebody and thanking them for what they have done for us, or simply being polite to somebody, or stepping aside to let them pass. Just small things like that. Don't underestimate small individual actions which normally pass without comment. And sometimes sitting down and thinking about the good that you have done can be very, very uplifting and wholesome and encouraging. So I would say that that would be the first part of doing this. Then at other times you may think like this: what good have others done for me? And once again, particularly with members of our family, perhaps our parents, they're there all the time. They're always there to reach out and help us and that. So often that sometimes we don't even think about it. They're just there. They just do it. And sitting and thinking about the things that others have done that have benefited us, including just small or minor things, can give us a deeper appreciation for the people that we come into contact with. So these are two aspects I see of Silanusati. And you might say pretty much the same with Karganusati or Dana Anusati, thinking about one particular and specific virtue, that is generosity. Now, when we think of generosity, we think of dana. Now, I think that this is rather important, because I have discovered in Sri Lanka that dana does not mean generosity. In fact, I've never heard it described as generosity in Sri Lanka. Because every time I've heard the word, it's not about generosity, it's about generosity to the Sangha. Bhante, have you had your dana? And I always say, no. How can you have your generosity? So what they mean is, have you had your food? Now, that's okay. But the problem with this is that the meaning of the word has changed. It doesn't mean giving food to the Sangha. It means being generous. And you can be generous with all sorts of things. You can be generous with your knowledge. You can be generous with your money. You can be generous with your food. Of course, that's an aspect of it. You can be generous with your praise, encouraging others. You can be generous with your gratitude. You can be generous with all sorts of things. If we think that dana simply means giving nice food to monks, and I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't do that, goodness, we'd all starve to death if you didn't. But if you make it so narrow that you think only that is dana, well, that is taking something very broad, very rich, very important, and narrowing it down to one thing. So the first thing is we can think about our generosity. How we have been generous with others. How could we be more generous with others? And then a second aspect of that would be thinking about generosity people have expressed towards us. Once again, quite often it is that people are very helpful to us in one way or another, and we never really think about it. thinking about our own generosity or that of others, once again, can inspire us to be perhaps a little bit more generous. Then this other one, which I think is very, very neglected too. I would be very surprised if any of you have even heard of this. And yet the Buddha does talk about it. In the Anguttara Nikaya, he mentions it in two of his discourses about the recollections, Kalyana Mittanusati. Now, most people know what Kalyana Mitta means. It literally means a beautiful friend. Kalyana means exactly that. It means beautiful. But it's not referring to physical beauty. It's referring to the beauty of generosity, commitment to the Dhamma, that sort of thing. So a Kalyana Mitta is a little bit more than just a good friend. It is what I would like to call a spiritual friend, somebody who takes an interest in the Dhamma, who may learn something from you or from whom you could learn something. So I know many people develop a close relationship with a particular monk or perhaps a nun because they lead a proper Dhamma-inspired life. They know a lot. I know a lot of people think of me as a Kalyana Mitta, and I know I have had the great privilege, an enormous privilege, of having very, very good Dhamma friends who I would definitely call Kalyana Mitras, beautiful in the broadest sense of that word. And in fact, I was a Buddhist before I left Australia. There was one particular person there, a woman as it so happens, an elderly woman who had been a Buddhist for many years. And she very early on encouraged me to read the suttas, which I think a lot of people, a lot of Western Buddhists don't do, or they didn't do at that time. She encouraged me, and I always remember her with great gratitude. And then when I came to Sri Lanka, I had the enormous privilege of meeting some really wonderful Kalyana Mitras. One who will always remain in my memory and who I think about quite often. He was a librarian at the Kandy Public Library. He was one of the most wonderful people I've ever had the privilege to know. And then two or three monks. There's one monk I had a relationship with, Mahosamedu, who was once again, a very remarkable person. And then somebody else I had a very close connection with also was Hinatina Dhammaloka, who used to live in Wallawata. He was, once again, I don't think I've ever met somebody who had so much Maitri. He was really a wonderful person. And all those people and others inspired me greatly to go into the Dhamma deeper than I had. They were real Kalyana Mitras. And I know that some people look upon me as a Kalyana Mitra, which makes me feel good. even now, not uncommonly, I get a telephone call from somebody I haven't had contact with for maybe a few years. Bhante, what's the meaning? Can you help me with this? Or my particular understanding or take on the Dhamma. I give talks. Not everybody likes what I say. Not everybody agrees with it. But some people tell me that they benefit from some of the things that I've said, and that makes me happy. It encourages me to do it more. So once again, thinking about being a Kalyana Mitra to others, and also how important it is to have a Kalyana Mitta. And then there's the other one. The next one is Marananusati, the recollection on death. I don't think it's good for people to spend too much time doing this meditation. But every now and then, I think it can be very wholesome. Sometimes we get caught up in worldly problems and other people, or we keep on reading the newspapers about horrible things happening here, there, or everywhere, and we get depressed or we get frustrated or, or disappointed. Or sometimes we have difficulties and we want to give up, or it makes us angry or something like that. And we take things perhaps more seriously than we should. Every now and then, thinking about the fact that one day, and you never know when, you're not going to be here. And when you do think of that, sometimes you get your problems in perspective. Yes, they're an irritation, they're a problem, but you're lucky that you're still here. For whatever reasons, you have many good reasons to be very grateful. Use your time well, because you never know when death will come to call. And that can ground you. It can make you more resilient, make you more detached from the problems that you normally have to deal with in life, the frustrations of life. And there's one thing you can be absolutely sure of. You will die one day. I find it very interesting when I hear people's, because, as a alhamdulillah, you often have to do funerals or something. And when you go to a funeral, you talk to the people and they say, oh, it was so unexpected. Really? Well, he should have expected it. In fact, I had a funny experience some years ago. Before I left Singapore, I thought I better have a complete physical checkup, which I had never had before. Test my heart, my eyes, my hearing. So I did the whole thing. Went to 4 or 5 doctors, had all sorts of tests. And the good news is that this was 10 years ago. The good news is that I was in perfectly good health. A little bit overweight, that was the only thing. Anyway, so that took about a week. I had to go to different doctors. And then shortly after that, a member of our society in Singapore, our Buddhist society, uh, his father died. So I went to they asked me to do the funeral, which I did do. And he was a pilot in Singapore Airlines. He used to fly airplanes. And he was only about 46 or something. Anyway, I was talking to his wife, or rather, I was listening to her while she talked about her grief and etc. And I asked her what happened. And she told me the circumstances. They were having lunch one day, and suddenly he stood up, clutched his chest, and literally fell down dead. And then she started to sob as she remembered that. And then through her tears, she told me, and only a month before, he'd had a complete medical checkup and he passed with flying colours. And I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me. I just had and I passed with flying colours. You never know. So, but thinking about death all of the time, I don't think necessarily is helpful. But every now and then, to reflect on that, yes. And the last of the recollections that I think is very worthwhile is Upasammanusati, the recollection on peace. Right now, the world is involved in at least 2 major conflicts. Or I should say, it is involved in quite a few conflicts, but there are 2 which are in the news all the time. One is in Ukraine, the other is in Israel. And it is rather sad to see how passionate people get about these. Now, I can understand the people in the conflict zones are passionate about this. But here in Australia, people are demonstrating in the streets about either one or the other or both of these conflicts. And it seems to me that when you hear the debates on the television and that there's a great deal of hostility between those who are for and those who are against, and yet their opinion really doesn't change the situation on the ground. Both of those conflicts, those ones that are in the news all of the time, are far from here. If our opinion made some difference, then it would be perhaps worthwhile. But we just feel flustered and excited and angry, and we develop hostility towards people who support the other side rather than the side that we support. And the consequences is that we just have no inner peace. And perhaps we might even be contributing to some lack of peace within our own community. So, recollecting on the fact that right now, in the culture and the society in which I live, or the neighborhood within where I live, there is no conflict, or there's very little conflict. And doing what one can, saying what supports the idea of communal harmony in the area where I am, speaking up for peace and goodwill. And one way that you can do that to make sure that you don't get sucked into these for and against, like and dislike, these attitudes that are anything than peaceful, anything but bringing inner peace, let alone peace within your community. One thing that can keep you from getting involved in such things is every now and then thinking of the importance and the value of both inner peace within myself and outer peace within my community. Every time we say something that creates or enhances divisions between people in the areas where we live, in Sri Lanka or Melbourne or Sydney or Colombo, or that's making no contribution. Where we can make a difference, let us try to make a difference. And one thing that can help us keep that in mind is every now and then reflecting on Upasammanusati, the value, the importance, the beauty of peace. So here we have them: Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, Sanghanusati, Silanusati, Kaganusati, Kalyanamitanusati, Anapanasati, Marananusati, and Upasammanusati. I think that it would be wonderful if every now and then you consider on a regular basis, once a day, at the end of the day, if you have a regular practice where you do a mal puja at the end of the day, or once a week, and then spend 15, 20 minutes selecting one of these subjects and reflecting on them, simply sitting peacefully, quietly, focusing your mind, and then thinking about the good that you have done. And maybe next week, the good, calling to mind the good that others have done for you, or your generosity, or other people's generosity to you, and so on. And as the Buddha said, you should develop these recollections while walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. You should develop them while engaged in your work and while living at home with your house full of children. Okay, that's all I have to say for this afternoon. So if there's anything anybody would like to ask, I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. Oh, I might add before that, this book is published in Sri Lanka. You can get it from the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, and I think it's probably available in what is it, Nadimala. There's a branch of Nadimala at the Buddhist Cultural Centre, I should say. There's a branch of it in the city in Colombo, and there's another one in Nadimala. So I think it's probably available both places. Incidentally, it is in Sinhala too. Somebody translated my English translation a long time ago, but I don't know what happened to it since then. Okay. Anything
Much
anybody
merit,
would like
Bhante,
to
for that.
ask or talk about?
We have now, can we first ask Venerable Olamde Ananda Mahathero, and also I think our patron Venerable Jnanasiha was here a minute ago. Good, Bhante Ananda, could you like to make a comment or question, Bhante?
No, just to thank Venerable Shravasti Dhammika Mahathera for the very interesting and inspiring talk. That's all.
Thank you.
By the way, I just discovered.
That's the first time anybody has called me Mahathera.
Yes, but you are.
You make me feel so old.
Yeah, that is the thing. And I realized when you said you came to Sri Lanka in 1976, I realized that I came one year before that, in 75.
Damn it. You were here a year before I came, really?
Yeah.
I remember we first met in what was the name of that meditation? What was the name of that meditation center where we met?
Was it Nilambe? No.
Waigiri Akanda.
Ah, Waigiri. Rock Hill Hermitage.
Rock Hill Hermitage, that's right. Rock Hill Hermitage, yeah.
Yeah.
Long time ago.
Yeah, I stayed there from 79 till 84.
79 to 84.
Of course, it was Godwin Samararatna who actually was the founder of the meditation center in Nilambe, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, yeah.
His pupil is still there, I think.
What's that?
Upul.
Oh, yes, I heard that Upul is still there, yes.
So that is one of the most interesting, well-visited, meditation centers in Sri Lanka. But Venerable Udu Iriyagama Dhamma Jiva said once, maybe more often, but I heard it once, that you and I were the ones to inspire him to become a monk. Before he was a monk, he heard you and he heard me.
Who was that?
This
Dhammajiva Thero.
Oh, yeah, it was me, yes.
Yes.
When I was at Peradini University, that's where I went for Pindapata in his home. That's how I met him.
Ah, okay. Yeah, Udi Iriyagama is just there. It's a village north of the. Very good.
Yeah, it's Kiribat Goda. Kiribat Goda.
Kiribat Goda.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we open the floor for any questions? Anybody, any questions or comments?
I think you'll have to
unmute yourselves and ask the question, please. Thank you, Bhante. That was a very unusual type of hearing about the Anusati Bhavana. Can I just say, because I had never heard of the Kalyana Mitta Anusati, instead of which we have Deva Anusati in that list.
Right. That's right. So in most places you'll get the Devanusati.
Go on, Bhante.
But in 2 or 3 places you have Kalyana Mitta Anusati.
Unstable internet, but I can hear you. But Bhante?
I think nobody can ask the question unless you.
Bhante,
Unmute.
any questions, please?
May I ask a small clarification? Bhante,
Yes, of
you,
course.
first of all, much merit to you for such an inspiring delivery. Why did you say that Marananusati you wouldn't recommend to practice frequently?
Oh, okay, right. Okay, so your question is, I said that doing recollection on death all of the time may not be good, because
Yes.
I've noticed that some people who do that become rather morbid and detached in a unhappy way. Now that's not always the case, but my experience generally is when I meet somebody who wants to do it, I think they're the very type of person who shouldn't do it. And the person who doesn't want to do it, perhaps it would be good for them to do it, etc. So I think every now and then I meet people who their spiritual life hasn't made them happy. They're unsmiling. They don't have a sense of humor anymore. They don't have lightness. You know, you say, well, you know, it's true that existence is dukkha, but look, there's that beautiful flower. And they say, yeah, but that'll be dead tomorrow. So if you're, I really think that a sign that your meditation progress or your journey into the Dhamma is going well, that it's a balanced practice, is that you become happier. And if you don't become happier, which I have found sometimes that happens with people who do the recollection on death, then I think that's not such a good thing. So that's why I said that.
Much
We
merit,
have
Bhante. Thank you.
Venerable Jnanasi Thero. I just again lost him. He was on the screen a minute ago. Bhante. Bhante.
Venerable.
Yes, I haven't seen Venerable Dhammika for a long time. It's interesting, this Upasamana Sati. I was thinking of Upasamana Sati is calmness of one's mind. The calmness of one's mind, being calm. Upasamana. The thing is, there are so many things happening outside, but these are beyond our control. And what happens is we get disturbed. But that's for that we have to develop upekka. On the other hand, there are conflicts within ourselves. And the conflicts within ourselves and to calm them is the most important thing I think that the Buddha's teaching was. So that Upasamana Sati has another aspect, that the calming of one's mind because of the conflicts that are there within one's mind. So that's only an observation that I have to make.
Yes, I certainly would agree with you. Yeah. Calmness or peace in every aspect, socially, psychologically, internally, externally. Yeah, sometimes there's a real battle, isn't it the case? Sometimes there's a real battle going on within us. Dissatisfaction with ourselves, disappointment with ourselves, or frustration about that we haven't reached the goals that we hoped that we would, or we blaming others for our problems. Yeah, there's lots of these. There's lots of these. If you think there's a battle going on in Ukraine, there's probably a lot of battles going on in people's minds too. But it's not necessarily easy to come to terms with them. But I think that that's the value of the Dhamma in general. Having a role model like the Buddha, or perhaps some inspiring and developed monk that you know, can at least give us the encouragement to know that it doesn't have to be like that. And Yeah.
Yeah.
Please go on, Venerable.
I was thinking there are some other aspects. Say peace, as you mentioned in the outside world, and Buddha's teaching. How is it possible for us to influence that type of problems that they have in the outside world? Ecology is a problem. So many problems are there outside, and how could Buddhists influence the get into a proper type of answers to those rather than having conflicts? So that's another aspect of it. But so one's internal development, and also how is it possible for us to help others in solving the issues that are worldwide? So these are two aspects.
Mm. Well, let me tell you a story. When I was young, that was at the time of the Vietnam War, and Australia was involved in that. And many young Australians, we had national service in those days, and young men were basically put in the army and went to Vietnam, and some died. So this was a very emotive issue, and there were big demonstrations against it and all sorts of things. And I'll have to tell you, as a young man, I was involved in that to some degree. I used to go to demonstrations outside the American embassy and that sort of thing. Anyway, at that time I was living in a flat in Melbourne, and with several other young people who were very socially engaged, like I was. And one day I read in the newspaper that an elderly lady had been found dead in her home because it was wintertime and she didn't have enough money to heat her home, and she had basically frozen to death, or she had died of cold. So I was reading this and I thought, that's awful. And then I noticed it was in the street where I lived. It gave the number of the house. And then I remembered I had probably seen that old lady either going to the shops or coming back with her shopping bag. She was very frail and very old. And this had quite an effect upon me. I realized I was concerned with a problem that was happening thousands of kilometers away, and I didn't notice a problem that was right next door, 5 or 6 houses down the road. And that has remained with me ever since. And I often read articles about Buddhism and world peace. Look, even the United Nations hasn't been able to bring about world peace. What chance have I got? Let's be realistic. However, I may have some influence on my community or on my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Now, in Sri Lanka, you've just basically recovered from a very brutal and bloody civil war. And there's still lots of people saying nasty things about each other. These people have done this, or those people have done that. Don't be a party to that. When you hear people talking negatively about other communities and that, stand up and say something. Yeah, that's maybe true, but that doesn't help our country recover. Let us try to put that behind us and to speak up for peace. There you may have some impact upon members of your family or your children or your neighbors. You won't maybe always be, your contribution may not always be welcomed, but to let others know that you, as somebody living by the Dhamma, I have no party in conflicts. I have no party in tensions between others. And to the best of my ability, I will say or do what I can not to encourage that sort of thing, to encourage peace and harmony and tolerance and acceptance. So that's what I think. As for the international conflicts and that, I'm quite happy to leave that to others. and they don't seem to be doing such a good job. So what can I do?
Thank you.
Bhante, there
Venerable,
are quite a few comments on the chat. Most of them are very complimentary and all of them thanking Bhante, all of them. But there's one question, Bhante, here from Dr. Sena. May I know if Marananusati means the obvious physical death or the unseen recurrent death as in Upada Titi Banga?
okay. I see his point, but it seems to me that the first thing when you think about death or dying is physical death and dying. But that doesn't mean you couldn't do it, as you just said, talking about the moment-to-moment death, the constant coming into being and passing away. It doesn't mean you couldn't do that. But I just focused on the most obvious aspect of death. But what you say is quite correct, and that could be done too. Yes. Anything else?
Mahendra, do you have a question? Mahendra?
No, I mean, nothing special, Manuri. Thank you.
Thank you.
Venerable Jnanasiha, you just briefly mentioned that we have met before. Sorry, can you remind me when that was?
Just I think we were following the course in the University of California also. We met Postgraduate Institute of.
Right. Oh,
I was
yes.
Alcott Gunasekara. Alcott Gunasekara.
Oh, I
That is
see.
Bhante's lay name. Bhante is our patron of the society, servants of the Buddha. Venerable Jnanasiha. And
well, that was quite some
Venerable
time ago, wasn't it? At the Postgraduate Institute
Yes,
in
1990s. Yes.
And what were you doing there, Venerable? You were studying or teaching, or?
No. I was a student.
Are you
studying.
a student also? Sorry, my memory is one thing that has died is my good memory as I've got older.
And Venerable, just one thing that I missed about a week ago is the Venerable's 90th birthday and his 10th anniversary as a monk. He got ordained when he was 80 years old.
And who is that?
Venerable Jnanasiha.
Yeah.
He was Alcott Gunasekara and then now Venerable Jnanasiha.
Oh, I see. Oh, goodness. I see. Yes, I do remember you. Now it's starting to come back. Any other questions, perhaps before we finish?
There is Sriya Kalupahan.
Yes, Bhante, I was right. I do daily the Saturaraka Bhavana, starting with Buddhanusati, Pilikul Bhavana, Parananusati, Metta Bhavana, and then follow up with Anapanusati. And I feel it makes it very peaceful to me. So I do Marananusati Bhavana every day. And for Buddhanusati, I try to analyze and think of all the 9 virtues of Buddha. And so I'm just saying my experience. I think of death every day, but it doesn't make me feel depressed or anything. It does calm me. I think when it's followed by Metta Bhavana, it seems to help me.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one thing that I think maybe the Buddha taught quite a lot of different types of meditation. And we've seen he even talked about different aspects of the same meditation. So, for example, these different types of anusatis. And I think the reason that he did that is because there are many different types of people. Each of us come to the Dhamma from a very different perspective. Okay? So what is good for one person may not be suitable for another. Or what is good for one person now may be less useful for them later. This is why I'm not a great fan of meditation meditation courses where everybody does the same technique.
Yeah.
And I remember very distinctly Godwin Samaratna when we would have a 10-day meditation course. We used to have a 10-day meditation course in the first 10 days of every month. And he always used to say to people, he would ask them, what sort of meditation are you doing, or what technique are you using if you've done meditation before? And he would never tell them, okay, drop that and now start doing the way that I teach. He never ever did that. He would give them guidance based on what they have already been doing. So his idea was, and I think that's a very sensible approach, is the approach that is best for you is the right one. And that might be quite different for somebody else. Or, as I said, what you're doing now might be very useful for you, but in time to come, something else may further enhance what you were doing previously. So I'm glad to hear that you do that meditation and it's helpful for you. And I could tell from your voice that you seem to be a cheerful and happy person. So that's good. Keep it up. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Anything else?
There are comments like many merit to you, Bhante, for making a complex topic simple and very practical. And many like
Okay.
that.
While we're waiting for some other question, I will mention that my new book has just come out in Sinhala. It's called Footprints in the Dust, The Life of the Buddha from the Most Ancient Sources. And it's a biography of the Buddha, but it is based only on what the Tipitaka tells us about the Buddha. It's not based on the later legends. It's in Sinhala, and Manori tells me that she hasn't found it in the bookshops yet, but it should be in the bookshops fairly soon in Sinhala. And the English one is available on Amazon Books. I don't know if Amazon does books in Sri Lanka, but that's where it's available.
I have a better colored version of it.
Oh, right. That's the first edition. Right, right.
The Sinhala one was launched here 2 weeks ago, and there were some scholarly monks speaking about it. But it was a Saturday afternoon, so I couldn't listen to all what they were saying. They were sort of, but it's still not come to the Nadimala, this Venerable Kiramajyoti's place. It hasn't come to them yet.
I'll ring them up and tell them to get it soon. Okay, anything else before we finish?
No, Bhante, thank you very much, because it was a very interesting and inspiring, insightful, with a difference. And I was reminded when Bhante said that Buddha's sort of, not only the Dhamma, but his character. I've read where Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru says that he says that he didn't know the doctrine. He doesn't know the doctrine at all. But from a young age, it was very awe-inspiring, this story of the Buddha which he had heard, and that he came to perfection. So against all difficulties, so that when he had a picture of the Samadhi Buddha statue in his cell when he was jailed, so many times I think he was jailed for the struggles for independence, he says that looking at the calm, strong features of the Buddha and how he came through all manner of difficulties to absolute perfection, made him overcome his own depressions and encouraged him. Just the character of the Buddha, he says, and that perfection aspect, he felt he could also win through. So that was Anusati of a sort, isn't it, Bhante?
I always tell my Indian friends, I always tell my Indian friends that India's greatest export was Buddhism.
And after the independence of India, Nehru always kept a statue, a smallish statue of the Buddha, a white statue, on his desk, sort of facing him.
Yeah, and that's true, Venerable, because once again, before I was a monk, when I lived in Delhi, once I went to Teen Murti, which was his house. And in those days, it was free, and you could just walk around. And his desk was there, and he had a framed picture of the Samadhi Buddha from Anuradhapura.
Yeah, but also a 3D picture. I've been there.
Oh, probably, but I don't remember that. That's likely.
Yes.
Okay, then, if there's nothing else, thank you for everybody, and thank you for Manori for organising this, and for Venerable for your...
usual way, Bhante, with Anumodana, and thank you with permission from all three Venerables, and we are much honoured that you are all gathered here and participated in the discussion, and thank you all Dhamma friends for having joined. Shall we have the Anumodana transferring merit to the Devas and the departed, please?
Yes, Venerable, please do that for me, Venerable Ananda, if you could.
Yes, you need a sip of water. Akasata Chubumata Devanaga Mahindika